There's a specific kind of cold that only exists in a server room. It's not like the crisp, clean cold of a winter morning. It's a dead, manufactured chill, heavy with the smell of ozone and the ceaseless, high-pitched hum of machinery trying to stave off its own heat death. For 15 years, that was my sanctuary. I'm Susan, and I was the lead IT administrator for Miller & Son Logistics, my family's company. The & Son part was my brother Jeff. The Miller part was my father, a man who built a respected regional shipping firm from the ground up with 2 trucks and a handshake deal. I was the silent ampersand, the connective tissue they never noticed but couldn't function without. Jeff, who was given the title of CEO when our father's health started to decline, always treated me less like a department head and more like his personal on-call help desk. My phone would buzz at 2 in the morning. Jeff forgot his email password again. It would buzz during my vacation. Jeff couldn't get the projector to work for his big presentation. I was the ghost in the machine, the digital janitor, the one who made sure the lights stayed on while he stood in the spotlight. Our final disagreement, the one that severed the last frayed thread of our relationship, happened in the main conference room. It was a sterile space with a long, polished mahogany table that my father had commissioned 20 years ago. Jeff loved that table. He loved to sit at the head of it, leaning back in his chair like a king on a throne, pontificating about the future. His latest obsession was a pivot to automated drone delivery. He had slick presentations full of artists' renderings of little octocopters, buzzing over suburban neighborhoods, dropping packages on doorsteps. It was a fantasy, a tech bro pipe dream, completely disconnected from the reality of our business, which was built on the unglamorous but profitable world of cold chain logistics, keeping food and medicine at precise temperatures across hundreds of miles of highway. I listened patiently, while he and the CFO, Dennis, a sniveling yes-man Jeff brought in from his business school fraternity, walked the senior staff through their vision. It was a vision that involved selling off half our fleet of refrigerated trucks and laying off drivers who had been with my father for decades. When he finished, he scanned the room, a smug smile on his face, waiting for the applause. Instead, I cleared my throat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stated facts. I presented data on the astronomical infrastructure costs, the current FAA regulations that made his plan impossible on a large scale, and the massive cybersecurity vulnerabilities of a centrally controlled drone network. I wasn't being emotional. I was being practical. I was doing my job. Jeff's smile curdled. His face went blotchy and red, the way it always did when he was challenged. He saw my competence not as an asset, but as an insult. In front of everyone, in front of Frank, our head of logistics who'd known me since I was a child, Jeff pointed a trembling finger at me. He said, "This is exactly what I'm talking about. This resistance to change. This old-fashioned thinking. It's what's holding this company back." His voice dripped with condescension. "Maybe you'd be happier somewhere that still uses floppy disks, Susan." The room went silent. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot wave that washed over my skin. He didn't just disagree with me. He belittled me, infantilized me, and dismissed my 15 years of work in a single sentence. He stood up, puffed out his chest, and said, "You know what? I think we're done here. You're done here. You're fired." Just like that. No private conversation. No severance discussion. Just a public execution. He told the head of security to escort me from the building and to revoke all my access. As I was packing the few personal items from my office into a cardboard box, a framed photo of me and my dad, a collection of novelty USB drives, a chipped coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Sister," Jeff leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. He had a look of triumphant satisfaction on his face. "Don't take it personally, sis," he said, the words slithering out of his mouth. "It's just business." He watched as security walked me out, a final petty assertion of his power. He thought he was cutting the cord, deleting the problem. What Jeff didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was that years ago I had built my own cord, a lifeline, a secret, off-site, heavily encrypted backup server that mirrored everything, not just data files and financial records, but every single internal communication, every email, every chat log. On that server, tucked away in a climate-controlled room 100 miles away, was the truth. And on that server, I knew, were the emails where he and Dennis planned to cook the books to hide their disastrous investment losses from our father. He hadn't just fired his IT admin, he had armed his enemy. The drive home was a blur. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the steering wheel. The public humiliation replayed in my mind on a loop. The shocked faces of my colleagues, Jeff's sneering triumph, the quiet click of the security guard's walkie-talkie as he confirmed my access was terminated. It felt like a physical blow, like the wind had been knocked out of me. When I got to my small apartment, the one I could afford on the salary Jeff deemed appropriate for his help desk, I locked the door and slid down to the floor. The cardboard box of my professional life sat beside me, a pathetic monument to 15 years of loyalty. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the constant hum of the server room that had been the soundtrack to my life. For the first time in a long time, there were no urgent system alerts to check, no forgotten passwords to reset, no digital fires to put out. There was just me, and a hollow, cavernous feeling of being erased. The first few days were a thick fog of despair and rage. I'd wake up, remember what happened, and the anger would hit me like a fresh wave, so intense it made my teeth ache. Then the anger would recede, leaving behind the cold, heavy sludge of grief. Grief for the company my father had built, grief for the relationships with coworkers I'd cherished, and a strange, bitter grief for the relationship with my brother that I finally had to admit had never really existed. He didn't have a sister, he had a tool, and when the tool stopped doing exactly what he wanted, he discarded it. I ignored the calls that started coming in. My mother first. I knew what she would say. She would tell me to be the bigger person, to apologize to Jeff, to smooth things over for the sake of the family. My mother was the chief architect of our family's toxic dynamic, a woman who valued the appearance of harmony over actual happiness. To her, conflict was the disease, not the injustice that caused it. Then came the calls from my father. I couldn't answer those either. Not yet. He was semi-retired, his health fragile, after a heart attack 2 years prior. Jeff had used Dad's health as the reason to seize more control, painting it as an act of filial duty, when it was really a palace coup. I knew Jeff would have already fed him a carefully curated story, painting me as a disgruntled, hysterical employee who couldn't handle the pressures of progress. The thought of fighting that narrative, of adding more stress to my father's life, was exhausting, so I let the calls go to voicemail, listening to their messages with a growing sense of detachment. I was an island, and the tide was going out. As I sat there stewing in the silence of my apartment, my mind kept drifting back. It's funny how your brain tries to make sense of a trauma by replaying the moments that led up to it, searching for the point where things could have gone differently. I remembered being 10 years old. My father had brought home an expensive, intricate model train, set from a business trip in Germany. It was his prized possession. He set it up in the basement, and it was the one thing we were all strictly forbidden from touching without him. One afternoon, Jeff, who was 13, decided he wanted to show it off to his friends. I warned him not to. He told me to shut up. An hour later, I heard a crash. I ran downstairs to find the main locomotive, the beautiful hand-painted engine, shattered on the concrete floor. Jeff's friends were gone. He immediately pointed at me and started wailing, "Susan did it." I told her not to touch it. When my parents came home, he put on an Oscar-worthy performance. Despite my frantic denials, they believed him. He was the golden boy, the charismatic heir. I was the quiet, nerdy one. My punishment was a month without allowance, and the cold, disappointed stare from my father that hurt more than any yelling could. Jeff got a pat on the back for being so responsible as to tell on me. That was the day I learned that in my family the truth was less important than the narrative. Jeff was a brilliant storyteller, and his favorite character was the victim. Years later, when I was in college studying computer science, the company website was a clunky, amateurish mess that Jeff had paid a friend $1,000 to build. It was constantly crashing. Our inventory system was a series of disconnected Excel spreadsheets that were a breeding ground for errors. I spent my entire Christmas break, fueled by cheap coffee and a sense of familial duty, building them a new integrated system from scratch. I created a proper e-commerce portal, a back-end database to track every shipment, and a simple, clean user interface. It streamlined their operations and immediately cut down on costly fulfillment errors. I did it for free. I just wanted to help, to prove my worth in a way that couldn't be denied. When I showed it to my father, he was amazed. He slapped me on the back and said, "That's my girl. You've got the real brains." Jeff, on the other hand, just sniffed and said, "It looks okay. Is it secure?" As if I, the person who built it, hadn't thought of that. He never thanked me. The new system became an integral part of the business, but my contribution was just absorbed, forgotten, like I was a contracted vendor who had delivered a product and disappeared. The pattern repeated itself over and over. A few years ago, we were hit by a sophisticated ransomware attack. It was a Friday afternoon. Our entire system was frozen, with a pop-up demanding $100,000 in Bitcoin. Dennis, the CFO, was running around like a headless chicken, screaming that we had to pay. Jeff was on the phone with the FBI, sounding important but achieving nothing. I locked myself in the server room for 48 straight hours. I isolated the infected machines, traced the point of entry, a phishing email Jeff himself had clicked on, of course, and painstakingly restored our core systems from the nightly backups. It was grueling, nerve-wracking work. By Sunday evening, I had the company back online, with minimal data loss. I had saved us. The next week, at a staff meeting, Jeff announced that he and his team had successfully thwarted a major cyber attack. He talked about his decisive leadership and quick thinking. He got a massive performance bonus at the end of the quarter. I got a thanks, Sue in the hallway, and an email from him asking me to look at his laptop because it was running slow. It wasn't about the money. It was about the erasure, the constant grinding dismissal of my contribution, my expertise, my very presence. I thought of something my dad had told me once, shortly after his heart attack, when he was feeling sentimental and scared. We were sitting on his back porch. He looked at me and said, "You know, Susie, you're the engine of this company. You always have been. You make everything go." Jeff is the shiny paint job. He'd meant it as a compliment, and I took it as one, but now I realize the flaw in the metaphor. You can't see the engine when the car is driving down the road. All anyone sees is the paint. After a full week of wallowing, of cycling through these memories of 1,000 tiny betrayals that had paved the way for the final grand one, something shifted. The self-pity began to feel indulgent. The anger, which had been a wild hot fire, started to cool and harden into something else. Something cold, dense and heavy. It was resolve. The catalyst was, fittingly, an email from Jeff. It was the first direct communication I'd received from him since he'd fired me. The subject line was simply "checking in." I opened it with a sense of dread, expecting a demand or a threat. It was worse. It was his attempt at magnanimity. He wrote, "Hey Sue, heard you were taking some time off. Probably for the best. Things are moving really fast here with the new vision. Just wanted to say no hard feelings. Let me know if you need help polishing up your resume. I've got some contacts. All the best, Jeff." Reading it, I felt a strange and terrible clarity. The condescension, the casual cruelty disguised as generosity, the complete lack of self-awareness. It was all there. He wasn't just my brother who had fired me. He was a caricature of an entitled boss, a walking, talking cliché. And in that moment, the grief I'd been feeling for our broken relationship finally died. You can't grieve for something that was never real. He didn't see me. He never had. And he never would. A strange calm settled over me. I stood up, walked over to my desk, and powered on my personal workstation. My fingers trembled slightly as I typed in the long, complex password to access my private VPN. Then I navigated to a bookmarked IP address, one that didn't resolve to any public domain name. I was prompted for another password, and then a two-factor authentication code from a physical key fob I kept in a fireproof safe. The screen flickered, and then a simple text-based directory structure appeared. M&S_MAWAR_archive. The off-site backup. The insurance policy I had built against my brother's incompetence. I hadn't logged into it in over 6 months. I hadn't needed to, but now I did. A thought, cold and sharp as an icicle, formed in my mind. It wasn't about revenge. Not at first. But reading Jeff's email, seeing the final, perfect distillation of his arrogance, I realized it was now. It wasn't about revenge, until it was. The idea for the mirror server wasn't born from a desire for vengeance. It was born from professional paranoia, the healthy kind that every good IT person has. It came about 3 years ago, right after I'd single-handedly saved the company from that ransomware attack. After the dust settled, I went to Jeff and Dennis with a formal proposal for a comprehensive off-site disaster recovery and business continuity plan. I had quotes from vendors, detailed architectural diagrams, a multi-tiered implementation strategy. It would have involved a subscription to a cloud service, dedicated hardware, and regular third-party penetration testing. It was the industry-standard, responsible thing to do. Jeff had looked at the 6-figure price tag and literally laughed in my face. $100,000 a year so you can have a toy to play with? No thanks, Susan. You fixed it once, you can fix it again if it happens. Dennis, ever the sycophant, chimed in. The risk analysis doesn't justify the expenditure. Jeff is right. We have to be lean. Lean. That was their favorite word. It meant starving the parts of the business they didn't understand, like infrastructure and security, to pour money into things they did, like marketing and executive perks. Their short-sightedness infuriated me, but it also scared me. I knew it was only a matter of time before another crisis hit, one that my quick thinking and our on-site backups might not be able to fix. A fire, a flood, a more sophisticated attack. So I decided to build my own solution, a secret one. It became my pet project. I acquired a decommissioned rack server from a company that was going out of business, paying for it with my own money. I found a small, secure colocation facility, 100 miles away, a place that rents out server space, with guaranteed power, cooling, and physical security, and rented a quarter rack, again paying the monthly bill myself. It was my money, my hardware, my time. I spent weeks of my own evenings and weekends configuring it. I installed a hardened version of Linux and set up layers of encryption, both for the data at rest on the drives and for the data in transit. Then I wrote the script, the elegant little piece of code that was my masterpiece. It wasn't a simple file copy. It was a differential synchronization script that ran every hour, on the hour. It would connect to our company's primary server, not as an administrator, but as a low-level, read-only user. It would compare the state of the company's data with its own, and copy over only the bits that had changed. That included everything, every file in every shared drive, every database record, and crucially the entire email exchange server. It was designed to be invisible. It generated almost no network traffic, and used credentials that looked like a forgotten system service account. It was my professional insurance policy, a break glass in case of emergency measure, against the day Jeff's arrogance finally burned the whole house down. I never imagined I would be the one holding the match. Now sitting in my apartment, staring at the raw directory listing of the mirror server, I felt a tremor of power. This wasn't just a backup. It was a perfect, preserved record of the truth. I started digging. I knew what I was looking for, but I took my time, methodically working my way through the email archives from the past 18 months. I started with Dennis's mailbox. He was sloppy, Jeff was arrogant, but Dennis was a coward, and cowards leave paper trails to cover themselves. It didn't take long to find the first thread. It was an email chain from about a year ago. The subject was Q3 investment performance. Jeff was crowing about a new disruptive cryptocurrency. He had invested a significant chunk of the company's capital reserve. My father had always kept a healthy cash reserve for emergencies, a lesson learned from lean times in the early days. Jeff and Dennis had apparently decided to use it as their personal hedge fund. The subsequent emails told a brutal story. The crypto coin, like so many others, had plummeted. They had lost almost $500,000 in 6 weeks. The panic in their messages was palpable. But it wasn't the panic of responsible executives concerned for the company's health. It was the panic of 2 sons who had been caught with their hand in the cookie jar. That's when the conspiracy began. I found the email chain where Dennis first proposed the solution. He called it balance sheet optimization. He suggested creating a series of fake invoices from a shell corporation. A company I found, with a little digging, was registered to Dennis's brother-in-law for logistical consulting services. They would pay these invoices with company funds, effectively moving the cash off the books, and then write off the investment loss against those fabricated expenses. It was blatant, clumsy fraud. Jeff, far from being horrified, was enthusiastic. He replied, "Brilliant. Dad would never understand this modern stuff anyway. He'd just see the loss and have a fit. This is cleaner. Cleaner." He was talking about deceiving his own father, the man who had given him everything, and he called it cleaner. The more I dug, the uglier it got. They had done it not just once, but multiple times, to cover a series of disastrously bad bets on volatile tech stocks. They were bleeding money, and covering it up with increasingly desperate and illegal accounting tricks. They were preparing to apply for a major line of credit from our longtime business bank, a loan they needed to cover their operational shortfalls and fund Jeff's drone fantasy. The loan application, I knew, would be based on these fraudulent financials. They weren't just lying to our father, they were about to commit bank fraud. I felt sick to my stomach, but also strangely electrified. This was it. This was the leverage. But what to do with it? My first instinct was to call my dad and tell him everything, but I hesitated. The shock could be devastating to his health, and he was a man who valued family above all else. He might try to handle it internally, to bury it, to save Jeff from himself one last time. I couldn't risk that. This needed to be decisive. It needed to be final. I needed an ally, someone outside the family bubble, who could see the situation clearly. My mind immediately went to Maria. Maria had been our HR manager for 5 years, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had tried her best to implement professional standards in Jeff's frat house culture. She had quit about a year ago, citing a desire for a less chaotic work environment, which we all knew was code for "I can't take one more day of Jeff's ego." We had stayed in touch, grabbing coffee every few months. I called her. I didn't give her all the details over the phone, but I told her I had been fired, and that I had discovered something serious about Jeff and Dennis. She didn't sound surprised. "Let me guess," she said. Her voice dry. "It involves creative math, and Jeff taking credit for something he didn't do." "You have no idea," I replied. We met the next day at a quiet cafe, far from the office. I laid out the story, showing her printouts of the key emails on my laptop. She read them, her eyes getting wider and wider. When she was done, she leaned back and let out a low whistle. I knew they were clowns, but this is a whole new level of criminal stupidity. "Susan, this is dynamite." Maria became my rock, my voice of reason. She listened as I talked through my options, my fears, my anger. She was the one who said, "This isn't just about getting back at Jeff. This is about saving the company, and protecting your father. Those drivers, the office staff, Frank, they all depend on that company. Jeff is going to run it into the ground." She was right. This was bigger than my personal grievance. This was about legacy. Maria had another piece of invaluable advice. "You need a lawyer," she said. Firmly. "Not a family lawyer. A shark. I know a guy." And then there was the other part of the leverage, the part that was more personal. As I sifted through the mirrored chat logs, I found countless conversations where Jeff and Dennis mocked their own employees. They had cruel nicknames for everyone, but it was what Jeff said about Frank that made my blood run cold. Frank was the head of our entire trucking and warehouse operation. He was a gruff, 60-something man with diesel fuel in his veins. He had started as a driver for my father 30 years ago and had worked his way up through sheer competence and loyalty. He revered my father and the way he did business. In a chat with Dennis, Jeff had referred to Frank and his team of veteran drivers as a bunch of dinosaurs who are too dumb to realize they're about to be extinct. He was talking about the men who were the very heart of the company, the ones who drove through blizzards and holidays to make sure shipments arrived on time. He saw them as obstacles to his shiny drone fantasy. That's when I knew I had another potential ally. Frank wouldn't care about balance sheets and shell corporations, but he would care deeply about betrayal and disrespect to his people. I carefully copied the fraud evidence and the chat logs onto separate encrypted USB drives. I now had two weapons, one for the business world and one for the heart of the company. The plan was beginning to form. It would not be a loud, angry confrontation. It would be a silent, systematic dismantling of my brother's world. My first move had to be precise and untraceable. On the recommendation of Maria, I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer named Arthur Davies. His office was in a sleek downtown skyscraper, a world away from the dusty industrial park where Miller and Son was located. Mr. Davies was in his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He listened to my story without interruption, his face a mask of professional neutrality. I handed him a single encrypted flash drive containing the core evidence, the email chains discussing the fake invoices, the Shell Corporation details, and the plans to use fraudulent financials to apply for the bank loan. He plugged it into a laptop that looked like it could survive a bomb blast, and spent 20 minutes reading, his expression never changing. When he was done, he looked up at me. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice calm and measured, "this is not just a family squabble. This is conspiracy to commit bank fraud, potential securities fraud, and embezzlement. Your brother and his CFO are facing serious felony charges if this comes to light." For the first time, the full gravity of what I held hit me. This wasn't just about getting Jeff fired. This could send him to prison. Mr. Davies's advice was surgical. He was adamant: do not confront them. Do not go to your father. Do not leak it to the press. Amateurs do that, he said. It creates chaos, and they can use that chaos to paint you as a disgruntled hysteric. Professionals use precision. We will not attack the king. We will poison his well. His plan was simple and devastating. The company's primary relationship was with Northwood National Bank, a regional institution that had financed my father for 40 years. They valued their reputation for conservative, stable business. They would not take kindly to being lied to. Mr. Davies helped me draft an anonymous letter. It was concise, professional, and chillingly factual. It didn't contain any emotional language or accusations. It simply stated that we were a concerned party with information that the upcoming loan application from Miller and Son Logistics contained materially false financial statements. It referenced the specific Shell Corporation, Logie Consult LLC, and suggested the bank's fraud department perform a forensic audit before extending any further credit. We sent the letter, along with a second encrypted flash drive containing the evidence, via courier, to the bank's head of compliance, a man Mr. Davies knew by reputation. We sent it from a mailbox, in a different city. My fingerprints were nowhere near it. And then we waited. The next 2 weeks were the most nerve-wracking of my life. I obsessively checked the mirrored server, every hour, watching the flow of emails, searching for any sign that the bomb had gone off. For a while it was business as usual. Jeff sent out a cringe-worthy company-wide memo about their bold new future. Dennis exchanged sycophantic emails with him. They were blissfully unaware. Then one Tuesday morning, I saw it. An email from Dennis to Jeff, with the subject line, "You Argent Northwood Bank." My heart hammered in my chest. I opened the message. Dennis was frantic. The bank had called him. They were putting the loan application on an indefinite hold, pending an internal review. They were polite but firm. They wanted copies of every invoice from Logie Consult LLC, along with detailed reports on the services rendered. The panic that erupted in their digital communications was a thing to behold. It was like watching a house of cards get hit by a hurricane. Jeff's initial reaction was pure bluster. "They can't do this. Who do they think they are? Call Dad, he'll straighten this out." Dennis, the more pragmatic coward, was terrified. "No, do not call your father. This is bad, Jeff. Really bad. They know the name." Someone talked. Their paranoia was immediate and intense. They started pointing fingers at everyone. First, it was a junior accountant they had let go 3 months earlier. Jeff was convinced she had stolen files. Then they suspected a rival logistics company was trying to sabotage them. They never once, in all their frantic exchanges, considered that the source of their problem could be the quiet, dismissed sister Jeff had so confidently exiled. Their attempts to do damage control were comically inept. I saw emails showing they were trying to hastily fabricate the service reports for the fake consulting work. They were trying to build a lie on top of a lie, digging their own hole deeper and deeper. The best part, the part that brought a cold, grim smile to my face, was my silence. My phone started ringing. It was Jeff. I let it go to voicemail. His first message was casual, almost friendly. "Hey Sue, just checking in. Been a while. Give me a call when you get a chance." An hour later, another one. The tone was more strained. "Susan, it's Jeff again. Listen, I need you to call me back. We have a weird IT issue, some old server logs I need to ask you about. It's important." I saved the message. Server logs. He was fishing, trying to see if I was the source of the leak, without admitting what he'd done. He was trapped. He couldn't accuse me of anything without revealing his own crimes. I didn't answer. I let him stew in his own self-made paranoia. Day after day, the voicemails got more desperate, more demanding. The silence, my silence, was my new weapon. It was a blank wall he could scream at, and it wouldn't scream back. It was driving him absolutely mad. The bank's audit was like a python slowly squeezing the life out of the company. With the line of credit frozen, cash flow tightened to a critical point. Suppliers started putting them on COD terms. The drone project, Jeff's precious baby, was put on ice. The panic at the top started to trickle down, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear throughout the company. This was the moment to deploy my second weapon. It was time to talk to Frank. Frank was the soul of Miller and Son. He was a man of few words, but his loyalty to my father and to the company's core mission was absolute. He had been quietly furious about my firing, but he was a company man, not a revolutionary. He needed a reason to act that aligned with his own values. Fraud was too abstract. Betrayal, however, was a language he understood perfectly. I didn't call him. I drove to his house on a Saturday morning. He lived in a modest ranch house in a quiet suburb, the kind of place a man who has worked hard his whole life builds for his family. I found him in his garage, tinkering with a vintage motorcycle, the smell of oil and gasoline hanging in the air. He was surprised to see me, but his eyes were kind. He offered me a coffee, and we sat on 2 overturned buckets in the garage. I didn't show him the financial documents. I showed him the chat logs. I put my laptop on a workbench and let him read Jeff's own words. He read the part where Jeff called him and his drivers dinosaurs. He read the part where Jeff detailed his plan to sell off the trucks and replace the drivers with automated assets. I watched his face as he read. His weathered, craggy expression hardened into something like granite. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at the screen, his jaw tight. Finally he looked at me, and all he said was, "The boy has no honor." That was all it took. For Frank, this wasn't about business strategy. It was a profound violation of the trust and respect that my father had built the company on. He was the karmic agent I needed. He told me he and the other senior managers from the logistics division, the warehouse foremen, the dispatch coordinators, men who had a combined century of experience, had been worried for months. They saw the money being wasted, the core business being neglected. My evidence was just the proof they needed. The following Monday, Frank and his entire senior team, 5 people who represented the entire operational brain of the company, walked into Jeff's office and closed the door. It wasn't a messy confrontation, it was a cold professional ultimatum. They presented a list of demands: a halt to all spending on the drone project, a renewed investment in fleet maintenance, and full transparency on the company's financial health. Jeff, cornered and terrified by the bank audit, reacted with his usual arrogance. He scoffed. He told them he was the CEO, and they would do what he said. That afternoon, 5 resignation letters landed on his desk. Frank, his 2 top foremen, and his 2 senior dispatchers. All of them, effective in 2 weeks. It was a mass exodus. A decapitation strike on the company's operations. A logistics company can't function without logistics. Jeff could have 100 drone patents, but without Frank and his team, he couldn't get a single pallet of lettuce from a warehouse to a grocery store. That was when Jeff finally broke. He knew. He must have known I was behind it. The precision of the bank complaint, the surgical nature of Frank's rebellion, it had my fingerprints all over it, even if he couldn't prove it. And that's when he deployed the family's nuclear option. Our mother, she showed up at my apartment that evening, unannounced. She had a key I had given her for emergencies, and she used it. I was sitting on my couch when the door opened, and she walked in, carrying a large Tupperware container. It was my dad's famous barbecue ribs, a dish so legendary it was practically a member of the family. The smell, which used to mean comfort and happiness, now just smelled like manipulation. She set the container on my coffee table. The ribs were cold. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured concern. Then she launched into the speech I had been expecting for weeks. "Susan, I just don't understand why you're doing this. Your brother is under so much pressure. You're tearing this family apart. This company is your father's legacy. What would he think if he saw you acting this way?" The old me, the Susan from a month ago, would have crumpled. I would have been consumed by the guilt, by the pathological need to keep the peace. But something in me had irrevocably hardened. I looked at her, at this woman who had taught me my entire life that my feelings were secondary to my brother's comfort. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just spoke the truth, calmly and quietly. "Jeff fired me, Mom." In front of the entire company. Jeff made a series of secret, disastrous investments. Jeff is the one who called Dad's most loyal employee a dinosaur. Jeff is the one disrespecting the legacy. All I'm doing is refusing to be silent about it anymore. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open. She had no response. The script she had come to perform had a part for a hysterical, angry daughter, or a penitent, guilty one. It had no part for a calm, rational woman, stating facts. The power shift was complete. I was no longer a pawn in their game. I was the one who had changed the rules. The final act was set in motion by the one person I had tried to protect, my father. Frank, out of a deep and abiding respect that Jeff could never comprehend, had called him. He didn't tell him about the fraud. He simply told him that he and his entire team had resigned, and that he feared the company he had helped build for 30 years was on the verge of collapse. That was the alarm bell my father couldn't ignore. He called for a meeting at his house. Not the office. His house, the place where we were supposed to be a family. He summoned Jeff, Dennis, my mother and me. It was to be a final council, a reckoning. Jeff and Dennis arrived together, a united front of blustering indignation. I could see it in their eyes. They had their story ready. I was the villain, a vengeful, unstable woman who had used her technical skills to sabotage the company after a righteous firing. They were going to paint me into a corner, using my father's love and my mother's desire for peace as their weapons. I arrived with nothing but a thin manila folder in my hands. I sat in the armchair opposite the sofa, where Jeff and Dennis sat, looking like two defendants at a trial. My mother hovered nervously by the fireplace, wringing her hands. My father sat in his big leather chair, looking older and more tired than I had ever seen him. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. Before Jeff could launch into his prepared speech, I stood up. I walked over to the coffee table in the center of the room and placed the folder down in front of my father. My hands were perfectly steady. I looked him in the eye. "Dad," I said, my voice clear and even. "I love you and I love the company that you built. This," I tapped the folder, "is what Jeff and Dennis have done to it." He opened the folder. Inside were not complex financial spreadsheets, but simple damning printouts. I had curated them carefully. The first page was the email from Jeff to Dennis, the one that said, "Brilliant, Dad would never understand this modern stuff. Anyway, he'd just see the loss and have a fit. This is cleaner." The next few pages detailed the plan to create the fake invoices from the Shell Corporation. The final page was the chat log, the one where Jeff called Frank and his team dinosaurs who were about to become extinct. I had highlighted the most incriminating lines in yellow. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rustle of paper as my father read. I watched his face. I saw the confusion morph into disbelief, and then into a deep, hollowed-out understanding. The color drained from his skin. This wasn't the fiery anger I had expected. It was something far worse. It was the look of a man whose heart was breaking in real time. He slowly put the papers down, aligning them into a neat stack. He didn't look at me. He looked at his son, his golden boy, the CEO, the paint job. He looked at him for a long, silent minute, and all the fight, all the bluster, just seemed to evaporate from Jeff's body under that heavy, disappointed gaze. Finally, my father spoke, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "Get out," he said. "Both of you, get out of my house." Jeff started to sputter, the old reflexes kicking in. "Dad, she's lying. She hacked us. This is illegal, what she did. She stole." It was then that I gave a slight nod toward the front door. On cue, the door opened and Mr. Davies stepped inside. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and an expression of calm authority. He walked over and stood beside me. "Mr. Miller," he said, addressing Jeff directly, "your sister did not hack anything. The data was obtained from a legally owned and privately maintained server, mirroring information from a system she herself built. It's a clean chain of custody." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Furthermore, a copy of this evidence has already been delivered to Northwood National Bank, which is why your line of credit is frozen. I suspect their forensic accounting team will be filing a formal complaint with the SEC and the District Attorney's Office shortly. So I would strongly advise you to stop talking." The transformation in Jeff's face was staggering. The arrogance, the indignation, the self-righteous fury, it all collapsed inward, leaving behind the pale, terrified face of a boy who had finally been caught. He looked at my father, then at me, then at Mr. Davies. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Dennis, the ever-practical coward, was already on his feet. He knew the game was over. He didn't say a word, didn't even look at Jeff. He just grabbed his coat from the back of a chair and walked out the door, abandoning his friend, just as he had abandoned his ethics. Jeff was left alone, standing in the middle of the living room, a monument to his own hubris. My father just pointed to the door. I said, "Get out." Jeff finally turned and shuffled out of the house. A defeated man, the charade was over. The new reality had begun. In the end, I didn't take over the company. I never wanted it. The damage Jeff and Dennis had done was too severe. To save it from the mountain of debt they had secretly accrued, and to protect it from the inevitable lawsuits, my father, with guidance from Mr. Davies and a team of restructuring experts, had to put Miller & Son Logistics into a structured Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was a painful, humbling process, but it was the only way to save the core of what he had built. He brought Frank back, not as an employee, but as a partner, to oversee the leaner, smaller company that emerged from the ashes. They were able to save the jobs of most of the long-term employees, the ones who were the true heart of the business. The shiny, expensive parts of Jeff's vision were carved away, leaving behind a company that was smaller, but solvent and, for the first time in years, honest. Jeff and Dennis faced the consequences. The bank's investigation led to a federal one. They were indicted on multiple counts of fraud. I didn't follow the trial closely. It wasn't my concern anymore. Their story was over. Mine was just beginning. I never spoke to my brother again. I have no idea where he is, and I have no desire to find out. My relationship with my parents is a work in progress. It's strained. There are long periods of silence. My mother still sometimes looks at me with a flicker of resentment, as if I was the one who broke the family, not the one who exposed the break that was already there. My father and I are slowly, cautiously, finding our way back. He calls sometimes, not to talk about the company, but just to ask how I am. There's a new respect in his voice, but it's tinged with the sadness of what he lost, what he failed to see for so many years. They are both slowly coming to terms with the toxic dynamic they created and enabled for decades. Healing, I've learned, is not a straight line. Looking back, it's easy to say this was all about revenge, and maybe in the end it was. But it didn't start that way. It started as a question of respect. It was about the quiet, competent people who do the essential work, only to be dismissed by the loud, confident people who take all the credit. I think about that a lot now. About all the silent ampersands in the world, the engines hidden under the shiny paint. I had to let my brother burn down the life I thought I wanted, just to see the truth of my situation clearly. Some people will probably say I went too far, that I should have handled it differently, kept it in the family. But when someone has spent years systematically undermining your worth, and is about to destroy your father's legacy, you realize that the family they're trying to preserve is just the cage they've built for you. Sometimes you have to use the fire they started to light your own way out. And that's my story. It's a hard lesson to learn, that the people who are supposed to have your back are sometimes the ones holding the knife. If you've ever felt overlooked, taken for granted, or dismissed in your own life, then you know exactly the feeling I'm talking about. I'd really like to know what you think. What would you have done in my shoes? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories about people finding their strength when it feels like everything has fallen apart, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because learning that you're not alone is the first most important step to taking your power back.